You go after the administrative state and they tear you apart. And this, I would submit, Addison, this is the number one problem we have in America today, whether we're talking about the CDC or the Fed. It's always these deep, permanent, entrenched bureaucracies that outwit, outsmart the political class. And they've been in charge of us certainly since 1984 in the Chevron decision, but arguably since 1883 from the Pendleton Act, which created the permanent civil service.
Welcome to the Wiggin Sessions. I'm Addison Wiggin. I'm with Jeffrey Tucker, one of my good friends and longtime colleague, and founder of the Brownstone Institute. He's in Lancaster, New Hampshire right now at what did you call it? A hippie gun convention?
It's
describe it better than that.
Yeah, something along. That's one of the good things about this event is nobody knows entirely what it is. 3,000 people are here, and so far everybody's just hearing talks about random topics and buying from vendors and milling around and starting a bonfire late at night, and I don't know, just that sort of thing. I guess they do it because they think it's a way of being free, and there's a
free or die.
Yeah, a sense of freedom here. So all I can tell you is that I never miss it because it's just too fun, and you meet a lot of fascinating people. And I usually give big talks, some ridiculous, some serious, and I've already given my ridiculous talk. And so Saturday night I get to give my serious talks.
What was the ridiculous talk?
That was about life hacks. A lot of the things I learned working under you. About don't use shaving cream and hack your shower head and turn up your water pressure and crank.
Yeah, we put that book together.
Yeah, your water heater and just all. And I added other things about how to shop at thrift stores and these sorts of things. So I went through my whole litany of life hacks, and it was fun. It was a fun talk, and then everybody shares their stories. The day they hacked the shower was the greatest day, and then the second greatest day was the day they gave it up shaving cream. This kind of stuff. So it's fun. And
I just want to tell you, I have done both since working with you, and it makes me feel better.
Well, that's my major impact in the world. Everywhere I go at it, some people come up to you and say, Jeffrey Tucker, I just want to thank you because of you. And I just want to stop them and say, I know what you're about to say. It's the shower head or the shaving cream, one or the other.
What is the serious talk about?
The serious talk is about the administrative state, and that's the yoke under which we've lived for the last 2.5 years. I mean, it wasn't the politicians really that closed your churches and closed your businesses and locked you in your home and told you how many people you could have at a dinner party and so on. It was the permanent bureaucracy, and welcome to the reality of America, in which the real government we live under is not part of the democratic system. And our elected representatives are tremendously naive. I mean, Trump, he said, I'm going to clean the swamp. Well, he didn't know he couldn't clean the swamp. He didn't have the power to do that.
Well, it looks like the swamp is going to clean him. That's the way it looks now, right?
Well, that's the way it goes, right? You go after the administrative state and they tear you apart. And this, I would submit, Addison, this is the number one problem we have in America today, whether we're talking about the CDC or the Fed. It's always these deep, permanent, entrenched bureaucracies that outwit, outsmart the political class, and they've been in charge of us certainly since 1984 in the Chevron decision, but arguably since 1883 from the Pendleton Act, which created the permanent civil service.
Right. Well, so tell me about the Chevron Act, and maybe start with 1883 first.
So in 1881, we had a president, James Garfield, and nobody remembers him because for all the right reasons, right? Those presidents in those days didn't do anything. That's kind of what you wanted a president. Yeah. But a guy came in
Empire of Debt. We said our best president was the guy that got run over by a train. Was that
right? Nobody remembers these people. So James Garfield, and he was pulling up into a Baltimore train stop, and a guy came up behind him and blasted him in the torso. And 4 months into his presidency, and Garfield died. And everybody wanted to know, why did you kill the president? Why would you do such a thing? Well, it turned out he's one of these people that expected to get hired by the new administration and did not get a job. And so from which his successor, Chester Alan Arthur, the next president, concluded that we needed a reform of the civil service so that way people wouldn't kill him, right? So the idea is to take the discretion of hiring and firing out of the politicians' hands and create a kind of a permanent state. So in 1883, the Pendleton Act was passed. Before then, every new president would fire all the old guys and bring in his new guys, and it's called the spoils system. Right. The Pendleton Act put an end to the spoils system and created this permanent bureaucracy of professional state managers, which sounds good, but it's not good. You know, after you have World War I and the income tax and the Federal Reserve, and then the New Deal, then World War II, then the Great Society, and then all the way up to the Nixon regulatory explosion, and then after 9/11, you know, after a while you get this enormous, overlay, that this meta layer that's the actual government, and with lockdowns they showed their face. They're like, okay, now here's our new rules: put plexiglass up in your business, and wear a mask, and don't go to school, don't go to church, forget Easter for 2 years, and so on. And we all wondered, who's doing this to it? And we contacted our representatives. Hey, these people are ruining my life. And he's like, well, that wasn't my doing. I never voted on it, And Trump wanted to fire Fauci because he thought Fauci had tricked him into the lockdowns. And then he was told, sorry, you can't fire. And he said, wait a minute, I'm the president. This guy works for me, doesn't he? Well,
not really.
In theory, right?
Yeah.
And this is and welcome to the real world, Mr. President. It's not just Fauci, but it's 2 million other people.
About the Chevron Act.
Okay, the Chevron case was even worse because they took this administrative state. There was a case of Chevron versus the EPA. And the EPA had interpreted congressional legislation very broadly to give itself more power than it would seem that the legislation enabled it to have. The Supreme Court decided in that case that if something isn't specifically forbidden by the legislation, we as a court have to defer to the agency's understanding of its own role, since they're the professionals. That was the Chevron precedent. And ever since, and that was in 1984, ever since then, the agencies will make mountains out of molehill. They'll take a word in a piece of legislation from 100 years ago and interpret that to give them all power over your life and liberty. And the court precedent was that the courts have to defer to the agency in all these cases. And that's always been true until the Florida judge in the mask mandate transportation case that happened earlier this year. And that federal judge said there is nothing in the Public Health Services Act of 1944, which restricted the importation of diseased animals, that allows you to force all passengers on every bus and train and plane in the nation to put on a mask. And this is ridiculous. This is an overreach. Okay. Well, the CDC is appealing that decision on grounds that courts cannot oversee us because of the Chevron case. That's our interpretation. That's all you need to know. So courts have they can't say we're wrong in our interpretation. We interpreted it that way. That's what we did. So you have to defer to the agency. Now, if this gets appealed to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court turns it back to the Florida case and says, okay, that was correctly decided, Chevron is then effectively repealed.
But this is the case that's making its way through right now, right?
Yeah,
because they were asking for larger authority for the CDC mostly.
That's right. And it's a hugely important case because if the Florida case decision was upheld, then every agency in Washington is going to be quaking because the lawsuits are just going to go crazy. You misinterpreted this congressional legislation. You've overextended your power. You're taking, you know, one or two sentences and using them as an excuse to exercise a kind of despotic control over my land, my life, my business, whatever it's going to be, and it's going to pertain to every single executive agency. So, but you know, in a sense, this is the most important case of our lives.
Is this is there a title for this case yet? Because normally it gets titled when there are decisions. Like, how do you follow it if you want?
Oh yeah, I don't know. I've just been calling it the Florida Mask. I forget now even the name of the nonprofit that brought this. It's called the Health Freedom Defense Foundation, something like that brought the case.
Yeah.
So it's Anthony Fauci and Biden. It's like Fauci, Biden versus and the CDC versus the Health Freedom Defense Foundation. It's gigantically important.
Yeah.
This 1944 Act, Public Health Services Act, is a fascinating one because I've read the Public Health Services Act many times, and I don't understand even the legislative history of that thing. I do know there was a parrot flu scare in 1929 where a bunch of people, rich people, were importing parrots from Latin America, which, you know, were considered to be diseased. And so there was this slaughtering of parrots that was mandated, you know, at the state level in the north, throughout the Northeast in 1929. So there was that. So I suspect the Public Health Services Act of 1984 came on the heels of that, but it's also passed in wartime. Like, why was it passed? This is also the very first act that permitted the federal government to have the quarantine power. Like, why 1944? I don't know, Addison. To me, this is worth looking into.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me because you and I have had this conversation many times, like, how does the Leviathan grow? Right? Like, it happens by legislative acts, and then it just, once they get in place, then they look for the next one. But who is the they? I know that you're saying it's like the bureaucratic state, but how do you explain that? How do you explain
it's usually associated with some, it's right. I mean, it's usually some emergency. And
a lot of the emergencies seem to be created, though.
Yeah. In 1944, obviously wartime, right? Yeah. And then you had the Department of Homeland Security created after, and what's that thing that's TSA created after 9/11, and then you had, you know, the lockdowns of 2020, and they're trying to use this, as we learned from the New York Times a couple of days ago, to create a new agency to lord it over the whole United States called the Public Health Agency, something like that, that's going to displace the CDC and sit on top of the CDC to make it illegal for South Dakotas and Floridas to exist on the next pandemic, so that everybody has to follow the same rule.
Yeah. It reminds me of what happened with when they did create the Homeland Security. They tried to, they did. I mean, they were successful at creating an agency that overlooks all of the intelligence that is used to fight terrorism and that kind of thing.
Well, they
have a model in place and they're just following it.
Yeah, and they believe that too many agencies and too much decentralization is always inefficient. And the way to solve all problems is to have a big new agency that sits on top of the old agencies, and that's going to fix the problem. They always trace the failures to a lack of coordination, right? That's always the thing. Not enough power, not enough coordination. We didn't have enough dictatorship, you know? So that's always the trajectory that the government seems to move into, because they always have to explain their failures. And the explanation is always, well, there was just too much confusion and we need more communication and more power. So that's going to be the result this time. But if the Chevron case really does, it gets upheld in Florida, it'll be a real blow to these institutions. Because they will not be able to, unless Congress specifically tells them to do something, they won't be able to do it. I mean, that's pretty mighty, you know. Like you mentioned the Department of Homeland Security. We know that, what was it, just a couple of months ago, Department of Homeland Security decided to establish the Disinformation Board that would, in effect, you know, have full control over all social media in the country. Who can post what, who has to be banned, you know, who gets prosecuted for violating the law. And so, all right, Congress never voted on that. They just did it on their own. They just interpreted the legislation to give them that power. Well, I haven't looked, but I doubt very seriously that any law ever passed by Congress permits the Department of Homeland Security to censor Twitter. You know, that's just not believable. Yeah. So these are powers that the agencies just grab on their own.
You and I are in trouble if they do that.
That's right.
Mostly just because we like to talk about these things. But
well, in fact, I'm amazed.
Brownstone Institute.
Well, I started it precisely because of these kinds of issues. I just felt like there needed to be some institution focusing on issues of the administrative state. The pandemic response was a calamity. You know, who's actually looking at this thing carefully from the point of view of science and issues of human rights and freedom. So I started the Brownstone Institute with a focus on that, because I just had some sense that we needed this to happen. We need somebody to focus just on this one topic. So that's all we do. And our traffic is outrageous. I'm getting all kinds of scientists all over the world posting great stuff that they can't get published elsewhere because the journals are all kept. And so we deal mainly with the effects of the lockdowns and how to stop it again. That's, I would say, the dominant part. But among those effects are economic, right? I mean, so all the things you talk about in your show, you know.
That's the big one, is that when you lock down the economy and then spend a ton of money to replace it, look what happens.
Yeah, and here's the thing, Addison, I'm so grateful for your show, and I'm surprised it's not banned on YouTube yet. Maybe our show will get the job done. You'll be mad at me in that case, but I'm not sure that everybody's connecting. You know, the fact that they're paying so much more for gasoline or for bacon, you know, or you know that their grandson is a lazy bum or whatever. You know, with the lockdowns. But that's where all this. You know this. I mean, this is what set the whole trajectory in motion. It all began March 2020, and you and I were watching it unfold, going, "Oh God, I can't believe this."
Yeah, I remember that vividly, actually, when it was Chicago, the mayor of Chicago shut down the restaurants.
Yeah.
And I think that was like March 11th or something. And I was shocked, and I was like, oh, that can't happen. Like, no way, that's not going to happen. But then before long, Baltimore was shut down, and then the entire country was shut down. Yeah,
it all happened. In my mind, it began March 7th with the shutdown of South by Southwest and Austin. And the mayor just said, no, we can't have this conference. 250,000 people were scheduled to be there in a week. Yeah. And on his own, he just shut it down. And I watched that unfold, and I thought, well, this is going to result in a decade of lawsuits. You can't do that in the United States of America. Well, I had no idea what was coming.
Yeah, it turns out you can.
And then, you know, and we watched it all unfold in real time. It's terrifying to have knowledge and watch what was happening. But we saw, you know, what was happening very quickly. Congress met. They passed $1.8 million spending bill. The Fed's balance sheet blew up, you know, like it had never before done in history. Then they began to drop the money into people's bank accounts, like as if from a helicopter. Mm-hmm. And you wonder why there's inflation? Come on, you know.
Yeah. Well, it was a trend that was in place. We go all the way back to Bernanke's speech, the helicopter speech back in was that 2003. It was in November. I remember it because we were getting ready to move back from Paris to Baltimore, and he gave that speech, and it was like, what? What are you talking about? But that set the trend in place. It was already post Greenspan, and it set the trend in place that went through Yellen, and now Powell is just trying to deal with it. Like they've wrecked it. And
I get the sense they're shocked at the inflation. They're shocked at the dislocations that it all caused. And and you and I were both there at the time in 2008. When the financial crisis hit and the Fed started doing QE1, QE2, QE3, and we all worried about the effects of this, right? We didn't know, is this going to be Weimar? This is a scary amount of money printing going on. But Bernanke had a trick up his sleeve, which was to have the Federal Reserve pay banks to keep their new fake deposits in the Fed under lock and key, in cold storage, in effect. That kept the hot money off the street. And that's why we didn't see these kind of effects. Well, the fascinating thing about that, my read of the situation, I wonder if you agree, is that the fact that they got away with this in 2008, 2009 created a kind of institutional arrogance. Jeez, we can print all the money we want. Yeah. I don't know what it is, some kind of magic.
All the Fed governors that are there now grew up in that. I mean, grew up, but they like cut their teeth in that era.
Yeah, that's right. So they began to reject the quantity theory of money and adopt some new theory, which was basically not a theory at all. And then the MMT, crazies got involved and said, see, you can print trillions of dollars. It's not even going to matter in the slightest bit.
Yeah.
And so coming into the pandemic, this is what they believed. Yeah. Well, the big difference between Bernanke and Powell is that Bernanke kept all the new money in cold storage. Powell dropped it in people's bank accounts and became hot on the street. And now you see the quantity theory of money working perfectly, right? M2 goes up $6 trillion to buy dollar for dollar every amount of debt that Congress created with its $6 trillion of spending. You can just map it out and see it's just so clear. It's like Milton Friedman, wrote it. And sure enough, 18 months later, we're seeing the astonishing price increases and everybody's going, geez, where's this inflation coming from?
So what do you think happens next? They're trying to, they just did a 75-point hike.
Yeah.
And it seemed to have no impact except scare people in the stock market.
That's right. All it's going to do is drive recession. And we could say that recession is essential to wipe out, to sop up or reach a new equilibrium, to get prices and money quantity aligned. But is it going to fix the inflation? I would say not right away. It's probably going to drive us to recession. But the real question is, how are we going to get out of this? And here, I think you have to deal with some more fundamental structural problems. Like the Fed is not going to fix it. I don't think so. They might be able to tamp down the inflation. They can certainly drive us to recession. But what's going to get us back on a growth path, And here, I think we have to go back to 1981 and understand what Reagan did. It wasn't just about Volcker raising rates. And by the way, they went up to 18 and 20% of the federal funds rate. It was not 75 basis points. We're talking about a serious, he believed that the federal funds rate had to exceed by some substantial margin the existing rate of inflation. All right. So if we're going to do that, you can forget about 3% rates. We need to be talking about 10% or 11% or even higher. Okay, we're not even thinking that way. So even the Volcker plan is not even viable right now. But here's the thing, Addison, when you think back on this, and I think this is very important, it wasn't just about getting the money printing under control. It was about inspiring a new spirit of enterprise in the country. a new friendliness to commerce, the dramatic tax cuts, the deregulations that were followed through on and carried out in the energy sector, in trucking, in
all the things that we need right now.
Yeah, communications. It was a huge friendliness to the idea of competitive enterprise, plus the tax cuts, and a new emphasis on growth. So the reason we left the 70s malaise behind was not just Volcker's prowess at the printing press. It was because we grew our way out of it with basically a new regime that believed in the spirit of enterprise.
You work closely with George Gilder and wrote the book Recapturing the Spirit of Enterprise during that time.
Yeah, that's right. And he was right about that. You go back
to Reagan, right?
Yeah, and it was a revolutionary book. You can go back and read it now, and it's such a breath of fresh air. But
I've read it several times since the pandemic, and I'm like, crazy.
I know. It's like a different world.
Why do we forget all that?
I know. It's like we don't believe this stuff anymore. I mean, you listen to Biden every day. I think just yesterday he was once again hammering gas stations, stop raising price, and meanwhile saying that these high prices of energy are good because we're going to transition to living off the wind and sun, as Janet Yellen put it in congressional testimony the other day. Yeah. What the hell? So
but here's the thing though, they make those statements, they say things like that, but then they hammer the oil companies for not producing enough oil.
It's just pure chaos, and it doesn't make any sense. And actually, like a scene out of Atlas Shrugged, the oil companies are finally fighting back. They're sending messages back saying, how about you stop denouncing us all the time and trying to regulate us out of existence? I mean, I was looking at charts the other day about the refinery capacity in this country. You can see that the green revolution, which is not chosen by consumers, it's entirely imposed by the federal government, is really having an effect. Our capacity is going down and down and down. And we have to change the mentality. I mean, it's got to be a fundamental shift. Attitudes toward fossil fuels. I'll tell you something else that maybe, have you thought about that? Probably you have, but Biden's always celebrating electric cars. But electricity is produced mostly through coal, which they don't approve of that either, right? They only approve of the wind and the sun, not coal. So electric cars isn't going to get there. We're going to have to have like Flintstone cars before these people are happy.
All right, let's move on from that, because the whole green issue, I have thought about that. Like, I'm all for electric cars. I don't like it. But the electricity has to come from somewhere. So I've written about that, and I know you have to. So let's just move on from that, because I think that's a rabbit hole we don't really want to go down. But I do want to say, and I'm sure you remember this moment too, you were trying to convince me that Bitcoin was a good thing. And you were sitting in my office and you're like typing away on your laptop, and you I was skeptical at the time.
Yeah, right.
So you bought me one. And you gave me a wallet, right? And it was like $1. And you did it while we were sitting in my office. I thought it was hilarious, but where the hell's my Bitcoin?
it probably went up to $100, and then it fell down to probably $3. I don't know.
It went to $60,000, and then it dropped down to 20,000. I was just writing about this the other day because I knew I was going to be talking to you, and then
that's so funny.
Funny because you gave me $1, and it would have been, if I kept the wallet and I knew what to do with it, it would be worth something like 21,000 right now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, which is very exciting. I like to think of Bitcoin as something like 3 steps or 4 steps forward, 3 steps back. It seems to be this pattern, and it shocks people all the time. I mean, it even this time it even shocked me, because I expected the floor goes up all the time, right?
Right.
Where's the
Well,
floor?
it should, if it's like any other technology.
It is, but it's so extreme. I didn't believe for a second that the floor would be $19,000. I thought it would be 30,000 because the high was 65,000.
Well, bold for a bit.
Yeah, so it's extreme, and what Bitcoin does is it tests the belief of the newbies, right? I mean, first of all, it robs the newbies, and it tests the faith of the gangsters, old gangsters like me, and we're like, was I right or wrong about this all along? You know, sometimes you wonder, but in the scheme of things, because while I was working for you, I wrote my very first article on Bitcoin when it was at like $14. And then it went up. And then after I published the article with you, it went up to 30, and everybody was accusing me of pumping the currency.
Really?
Oh, like I had that power to do that. And then it went up to 60. And I was feeling pretty good. Like, well, maybe I'm just a prophet here, you know. And then, the blink of an eye, of course, it was back down to like $16, and everybody was throwing tomatoes at me, you know. So, you know, but these numbers sound silly now compared to a floor of $19,000. Would we ever have believed that back in the day? I mean, that's very high. But the problem is different now, Addison, because in those days when you and I are flicking crypto back and forth to each other just to play games, now we have a huge industry that's arisen around these assets, and they have to have employees, and they have infrastructure, and they have cost to pay. And if you're assuming that you know that the Bitcoin price, we're using Bitcoin here as maybe a
Proxy, really.
Proxy for the whole industry. And if you think that the worst we're going to do is 30,000, but you start to count on this sort of above 60,000 price, and you're doing hirings, and you're buying real estate, and you're all in with your business, and then you wake up one morning and it's $19,000, that's pretty scary industry to be involved in. And even something like Coinbase just withdrew thousands of labor contracts from people that they had promised to hire, and then sent a note and said, look, that contract we just sent you is null and void. And people had quit their jobs at Goldman Sachs and Merrill Lynch and everything, go to work for Coinbase, and suddenly they're getting their job. So it's devastating for the industry.
So I have this one theory, and I've been trying to work it out, so maybe you can help me. When we went through the tech wreck, there was a lot of companies that were like tacking on .com to I remember Corning was a big deal. They were laying fiber optic cable, and they tacked .com on, and the stock went crazy. And then people realized that it wasn't really a thing, and it crashed, right? We all had that experience. But we were left with email and websites, which I was in the process of like developing the daily reckoning and trying to like figure out how all that stuff fit together. And we still have that. And we're, that technology resonated, like it works. And we've built an entire new economy using what I call the detritus from the tech wreck.
Yeah.
And I think that this is my theory anyway. It's going to be the same with blockchain. We're going to see a lot of these cryptocurrencies just disappear. And there's a lot of people that are going to have to reposition their employment structure, like what you're saying. But we're going to be left with a really valuable tool. Blockchain allows you to own stuff online in a way that that wasn't possible before, and no one had really conceived of. And then the crypto craze kind of made it a thing.
Yeah, and you know, there are use cases even now of Bitcoin that cannot be duplicated through conventional finance, and the one that stands out to me is international remittances. You know, because if you try to get money from Japan or from Brazil to the United States, or from the United States over to Beijing or something like that, you know, and working through conventional banking transfer services, it's you know, looking at, you know, tremendous headaches and weeks for clearing times, you know, whereas with crypto, it's very inexpensive and it's instantaneous, and you go outside the banking system altogether. So that's a very common use case, and I think that's the best use case. Well, we had hoped back in the day, at least I had hoped back in the day. You were much more skeptical than I was. I was a classic case of the, you know, the new convert, you know. But I imagine that
I learned this phrase from you. I'm a late adopter.
Yeah, right. That's right. I did call you that, didn't I?
Yeah. But the thing about late adopters is they get really excited once they adopt. But I learned that phrase from you because you're like, come on, man.
Yeah, that's right. I was trying to get you to upgrade like everything. I remember.
Yeah, I think I
operating system
because of you.
God, I had forgotten about that whole period. That's so funny. But the international remittances have survived. I thought that we'd all be by now, you know, buying our sandwiches, you know, ham sandwich at lunch with Bitcoin. That didn't happen because it couldn't scale,
right,
like we expected. By 2015, it was obvious this main thing we call Bitcoin was unable to scale to accommodate a widespread adoption. And that was a devastating realization. And then, of course, then all the other coins jumped in the market and said, we can scale. But of course, none of them had the network that Bitcoin had. So it's a bit of a screw up. But here's what troubles me about this remittance point. And you see this happening now. Central banks are all trying to develop their own cryptos so that they can become the new source of international remittances. And once that happens, you've got a potential real problem. It's very easy for governments then to just simply crack down on cryptos and say, look, you can only use one crypto, and that's our crypto, our central bank digital currency. That becomes programmable money and actually quite terrifying. I mean, that's a little bit of a dystopian view. And it would be terrifying to think that the technology that you and I were so excited about, how it would liberate the world, would actually become the technology that would make possible its ultimate enslavement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of the I guess the eye-opening part about the lockdowns and the pandemic is that I forgot what you called it, but like we could call it the deep state. If they just get a hold of the money, then that's
and I'm sure you've written
an
about
evolution of money anyway, and we already know that. But if they can control it digitally, that just gives them more capacity to lock things down or choose what you can buy and sell. Like they can actually just block your transactions, that kind of thing.
That's right. And
that's what's more frightening to me. I don't think that will ever happen, by the way, because I believe that we have a history of liberty, like you're in New Hampshire right now, live free or die, right? I just don't think that we'll put up with it.
Well, we put up with a lot over the last several years, so I worry sometimes because I never thought we'd put up with the abolition of religious holidays, you know, from in the name of virus prevention. So although I think you're right, the last 2.5 years have trained the American public to be a little more on alert to the despots around us, and we're starting to see that in certain electoral outcomes and that sort of thing. But just to dial it back slightly on this issue, what concerns me the most about central bank currency is the idea of putting an expiration date on money. Because what that would allow them to do is control that thing they can't control right now, which is the velocity of money, which is the V part of the equation exchange. So they can control the money, but they can't control its velocity, which is the rate at which we spend it between each other. Our incentive, because sometimes we just stuff money in the mattresses because we don't trust them, right? So we hang on to our cash. But if they can put an expiration date on that cash, which is what programmable money allows them to do. They can force you to use the money before it becomes worthless. And in that way, they have more control over that velocity, which gives them a lot more central planning power. Or at least that's what they believe. That would be truly, I think, terrifying. That's what I think that's what they're really going for. Yes, a social credit system, but more than that, they want to put expiration dates on money so that they can print $6 trillion. And they say, well, you have to spend this before next December, or else we're going to demonetize it.
Yeah. I hate this phrase "they" because
I know
it's actual people that are thinking this way.
Sure.
And it's like operating on theory, but it's hard to figure out who those people are.
Sometimes it is, right?
They don't tell us when they give press conferences and stuff like that.
I don't know. Sometimes I think, people think it's all about Klaus Schwab. Well, I think that guy is just a clown. I mean, he's just some sort of ringmaster, of this ridiculous show in Davos. I mean, I don't believe he's the center of some global conspiracy. I think he's a ridiculous self-promoter. So who else is in the running? Bill Gates? Yeah, right. He's just a checkbook. I mean, he's an idiot with the check. I'm not impressed by him at all. I mean, read his book. I mean, the guy, how do you write an entire book on viruses without understanding the first thing about them? Only Bill Gates can do that. So it's sometimes hard to figure out, I think a better explanation is the bureaucracy, and the administrative state always kind of at the margin wants to protect their jobs and get more power of the population. They're meddlesome, maybe not one individual, maybe not one agency, but as a group, that's their means of survival and thriving, is always more power. So unless we can somehow restrain that, I think that's just going to keep heading in this direction.
That's part of what I think is that the incentives are misaligned. If we're interested in promoting liberty and freedom and like your ability to make a living and raise a family and choose which religion or whatever, like all of the things that we believe are true, the incentives for people that are involved in the bureaucracy are not aligned with that, because their goal is to hire more people, train them to control more things. And then the more people that you have under your whatever control in the employment structure of the government, then the more power you have and the more you can decide things for other people. And those two things they're not aligned.
Bureaucracy is like organization.
I know that we've talked about this a lot, so it's
fascinating. And bureaucracies like to organize things. And for them, the word freedom and the idea of freedom, it just sounds like chaos. It's like, a bunch of people doing random things you can't predict or know about or control. That's not what we're here for. We're here to organize stuff. I remember the very first time I filled out a tax return when I was like, I don't know, 16 or something like that. I remember looking at their list of employment things. You have to let the IRS know exactly what it is you do. And I remember thinking at the time, how is it possible that government can name every conceivable occupation? I mean, what if I figured out some new way to make money, playing harmonica on the street or something like that? I don't know, just make it up. I did, something struck me as strange about that. Like, why is this bureaucracy feeling the need to define every occupation and force me? I mean, I know it's an obvious point, but this is always the trajectory. They want to organize and classify and put things in certain files and tell those people what to do under these conditions. And there's always a trajectory towards organization. Whereas the idea of freedom is that you're better off without all this stuff. You're better off innovating. Like Gilder says, the spirit of enterprise should always be the driving force. And with that comes a lot of uncertainty. and unknowns, right? Bureaucracies don't like unknowns.
I'm just thinking while you're talking that in my basement right now, and I set up this entire studio thing so that I could be able to do the Wiggin Sessions. And if I had to get permits or something like that, it would never have happened.
Yeah, and you probably are supposed to.
Like you already said, like this conversation is going to get us banned.
You never know, but that's right. And I don't know. We live in very strange times. I was shocked. I mean, you've started many businesses in your life. And kind of a novice at this, but I was astounded when I founded the Brownstone Institute. I thought, oh, I'll start a happy charity where we kind of sit around and think about issues of public health, you know, and distribute that to the public. Sounds like a nice idea. I had no idea. For the first 4 or 5 months of our existence, 90% of my time was spent on administration, complying with this, complying with that, complying with that. And after a while, these papers just pile up and they pile up and they pile up. And you start just reading endless documents and signing here and signing there and paying this and paying that. It's unbelievable. And I did all of this before I had ever hired a single employee, you know? And once you do that, you encounter another layer. You cannot just in this country pay somebody to work for you. It doesn't work like that. They have to be fully registered in every state in great detail, and if their residency is across the border, then you have to register in a new state. And it's the withholding taxes, and then every state has new regulations. Well, what are you going to do about disability? You know, what are you going to do about health insurance? You know, what are your benefit packages? Well, Massachusetts requires that you offer, you know, the following benefits and so on. It's absolutely astounding. So you end up having to hire people to do nothing but, you know, to file paperwork. Right? Yeah. Your first employee just turns out to be just a complete compliance officer. They spend day in and day out just making it possible for you to pay an actual employee, you know? Yeah. Well, that's this country.
That's even true if you hire yourself.
Yeah. I don't know, Addison. I think these kinds of issues, a serious Congress, a serious legislature just has to take them on. We can't live like this as a country. I mean, it's not viable. You can't have an enterprising, growing economy under these circumstances where it's essentially impossible to start a new business. You know, yeah. I'm aware of a Persian grocery store that I do all my as much trade as I possibly can with them, because all their prices are much lower than even the Aldi's or the discount grocery stores. And one time I asked the owner, how come this is true? And he said, well, he has his own supply chains and they're very reliable. He said, but more than that, he said, I only hire family members and friends of family. And a lot of them are working for just very, very low wages. I don't have an HR department. I don't have a huge back office for compliance. I'm just getting meat and vegetables in the door from my other friends and asking my friends and family to sell them to customers, and that's it. So I have very low overhead. And that's completely unlike the Big Y and Aldi, and to say nothing of Whole Foods, right? They have this gigantic administrative overhead. And so when the inflation comes, they don't have the ability to absorb the new costs because they're just the sheer costs of their labor pool and the administrative overhead of these big companies is so vast, they have to immediately throw every new higher price off to the consumers, whereas my sweet Persian small business doesn't have to do that. That's very interesting.
Jeffrey, if people want to get involved with the Brownstone Institute, what should they do?
Well, you just go to thebrownstone.org. You know, I have a subscribe button there. I only send one email a week, mainly because I have to do that myself because I don't have anybody I've employed to send those things yet. But I always appreciate that because as you know, the email addresses you have, you own. Where they can cut you off Facebook and cut you off Twitter and cut you off YouTube, but you own those as a company. You own those email addresses. So I like to collect those, and of course we have a donate button that I really always appreciate people use.
So it's good to catch up with you. I haven't talked to you in probably a couple of years now.
Yeah, Addison, it's really great to reconnect with you and remember the good old days. And let's hope we're together. Let's make some new good old days.
All right, sounds good.
Okay,
I will talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.